Welcome to Epicenter, a series of in-depth interviews with renowned business leaders and industry influencers who are shaping today's digital economy. To check out previous episodes from the Epicenter, check out our website, www.epicenter.co. Today's guest is one of the most influential, inspiring, and amazing women in technology that I have ever known. Actually, I've been stalking her for years and hoping that one day I would get to meet her, and I have. And getting to know this guest over the past few years, who's been a leader at Google, Twitter, Cloudflare, even BCG and Visa. She's an accomplished author who has written an amazing book, Don't Quit Your Day Job, which we'll be talking about today as well. Grown successful businesses on a global scale. What else can I say? She's a personal hero of mine. Aliza, welcome to Epicenter.
Thank you, Ronen. So nice to be here.
Oh, it's so amazing that, to have you come in and visit us here in our new studio.
I'm so delighted to be back in Bangkok after so many years of being away, due to COVID. In my role at BCG, I used to, which is now probably 20 years ago, I used to come here every other week. So I really miss it.
Wow, this must be like a homecoming for you.
It is.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned BCG. Maybe tell us a little bit about your career and kind of how you got to where you are.
So now that I've been in tech, I have divided my career with hindsight into software releases. So 1.0 was the Boston Consulting Group and financial services. So I mostly consulted to banks and financial institutions at BCG, then worked at Schwab and Visa. Then I pivoted to tech and was at Google, Twitter, and Cloudflare, as you mentioned, as well as a small startup for a little while. And so that was 2.0. During COVID, I had a big birthday, and my newly adult kids couldn't get into Singapore where I live, so that was a bit disturbing. And so I decided I wanted more flexibility, and I launched Aliza 3.0, which is what I'm in now. And it consists of about a third of my time on boards of directors, both private and public, a third of the time a bit more for me, so a little bit more yoga, a little bit more badminton, a little bit more travel, and a third of my time around the book, which I see as a way of giving back, and mentoring, mostly mentoring two very specific individuals, an Australian female Olympian and an Afghan student who I've been with for quite a long time, who I've worked with when she was at university in Chittagong at AUW, and then getting her out of Kabul and now in the U.S., and then a little bit of what I call, coffee mentoring on the side.
And you also have this concept that you call a personal board of directors, who people choose you, and I'm sure you also have your own that play into this. Thank you. And I love that, the concept of 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, because it talks about all of us. We have this evolution through our lives and our careers, and at every point there's a different kind of phase that we go through and contribution that we do to the business world and to society.
Right. I'm not always sure as you're entering the next phase that you realize it, but when you turn around and look back, you can say that was a switching point.
Great. So you talk about your success. It's not only depends on hard work, right? It's about the ability to generate and to maintain these genuine relationships. And this is something that we need to be able to maintain throughout our professional lives. Why do you think this is such an important part in people's careers?
So I think it's important for a lot of us, not everybody. I think that there are examples of people who have basically not built a lot of relationships and not necessarily been particularly affable or friendly, who have succeeded, if you consider success to be running a business or making a lot of money. So I wouldn't say it's necessary. It's necessary for me to enjoy my job and my life. So I wrote the book basically because it was a way of scaling all these meetings that I have with people. I can't mentor everybody I meet, and not sure that everybody wants me to mentor them anyway, but I get more requests than I have time for. And if there's one thing I learned in tech, it's that you need to be able to scale. So I thought maybe I could scale by writing this book as a way of giving back, and then all the author profits are going to a a group called Vital Voices, which is an NGO that tries to get women into positions of power around government and policy making. So it's just, a few little ways of giving back. So one of the chapters is connectivity trumps tech, even in tech. And, what that means to me is that interpersonal relationships are even more important than technology for building collaboration, for getting people to work together, for getting employee engagement. So I don't mean it as a substitute for competence at your work or mastery of your job. But I think if you look at many of the companies that we work in today, which have matrix structures, or both you and I have always been in organizations that are global, and we're not where the headquarters is. So how do you make that work when you need help from somebody in another part of the world? How do you make teams be really engaged and willing to assist each other when they don't see each other necessarily? And I think a lot of that is around personal connection. And so, that's particularly challenging in our new sort of hybrid world. I don't know how many companies are going to fully remote, but a lot of them are going to hybrid, so less time in an office where you might see somebody every day. So how do you build those relationships? And I think when you have built those relationships, you'll see that more opportunities come, or you'll see that you get work done better. So I could give you a couple examples. These are in the book, but hopefully there's still more in there that you won't have read. The book is full of, I think there's about 36 people in there, men and women, all ages, heavily Asian or working in Asia, especially including Australia, but also US, Europe, Latin America. And so there's one about a guy named Rahul Desai, who I worked with at Google. And when I started at Google, I was in Mountain View for about 7 months. And, to just learn the ropes before I moved back to Asia. And I had worked with this guy a little bit, and I thought he was great. And we traveled together to get something done after I'd been there maybe 4 months. And we were in one of those big revolving doors at a hotel, not the ones that have 4 parts, but 2 parts, so that you can actually be in there with somebody. Yeah. So I had him captive for like 2 seconds. And I was like, Rahul, how would you like to move to Asia and work with me at Google Asia? And, he thought about it. And because of sort of the serendipity of us having been thrown together early on, and then doing this trip together where we got to know each other a little bit, and so we had built some connection, he was willing to consider it, which was great for me because I could really use his support, and he understood sort of things at Mountain View, and he was learning about and excited about Asia. And it turned out to be great for him. He asked his fiancée if she was willing, and she was, and they came for a number of years, much longer than they'd originally intended. And I think he would agree that he maybe got promoted faster and certainly learned more than he would have if he'd stayed where he was. So that's one example where connectivity that wasn't it wasn't on purpose. There was no okay, I'm going to build a relationship with this person, but it happened, and then it led to success in his career. Another kind of fluky one, which is why I think serendipity is kind of important. I met Vince Cerf when I was at Google. I met Vince Cerf when I was at Visa, and he was already an evangelist at Google because he is one of the guys who really built the internet along with Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And at that time I was in the Bay Area, and I thought, okay, I wrote the thank you note, that I'm supposed to for work, and I thought, wow, I'm really missing out. This internet thing is going on all around me. We've already had the first .com boom and bust, and I don't really know anything. And I thought, can I be audacious enough to write to him? I mean, I am outspoken and I'm energetic, but still writing. I'm not that shy, but writing to somebody that senior, that well respected, when you've met them under one auspice, was still a bit daunting to me. So I sat on it for a couple of weeks, and then I finally wrote him from my personal email instead of the Visa email and said, would Google ever talk to somebody like me? I understand that I'm older than the people you're currently hiring on average, and I'm not experienced in tech, but gee, I'd love to contribute and learn. And that eventually led to a series of interviews and my joining Google. So that's another one where this one's about serendipity, which I think is opportunity plus action. I met him, that was serendipity. The fact that I did something about it was the action. Often works well in people's life, and that's about connectivity too. Sometimes we just miss those. I can't tell you the opportunities I missed because I missed them.
Right.
right? But I think there's a lot of that. And then just in terms of getting things done, right? I have a friend who recently left Google who said, I don't take a meeting, I make a friend. And why is that? She's in comms. It's because sometimes stuff happens in Asia and they need, for example, Google headquarters to be prepared in the morning, but currently they're asleep. In order to deal with that, if it's an emergency, she needs to call one of her colleagues and wake them up at 2 in the morning and go, I'm really sorry, you got to get up because Sundar's got to know about this when the press calls. And because she's made friends with them, and she doesn't do it too often, they're okay when she wakes them up in the middle of the night. So those are just a few examples where I think the capability to stay in touch is all there through tech, but the desire to do it and the bonds that are formed are through personal connection.
Right. So kind of like, there's the saying, it's who you know, not what you know. But I think in this case, it's who you know and what you know.
Yeah. I think what you know is a prereq. Like,
Yes.
I don't think you can get rid of that.
Yeah. And that's good advice. And it's actually something that I tell people when they ask me, like, oh, what do I need to do to be successful in this company? I say, okay, these are the 3 or 4 people that you need to establish relationship, whether it's in APAC or at HQ level, because those are the people that you will have to call on one day. And actually, I personally did that. There was someone who joined the company that I reached out to and set a meeting, just like, let's get to know one another. And I mean, I still do that, and because not everyone in the company knows me, right? So we have to continuously to manage our relationships and as well manage the personal collateral.
Right. Well, I think it's the personal social capital, and it's fun, right? I mean, I think we spend a lot of time at work every day. And even, I know there's all this discussion now about the quiet quit, which I'm not sure I love because it feels soul destroying to me. But even if you said, okay, well, I'm only going to do exactly what's necessary and put in exactly the amount of hours, that's still like 8 hours a day. You may as well enjoy it. And I find most of the time people you work with, there's something interesting about them. You can find, I don't know, there's a guy that I met at Cloudflare. It turned out we're both addicted to Diet Dr. Pepper. I mean, that's a weird little quirk, yeah. But, it's something we have in common. And because it's hard to get, we both look for it and tell each other if it shows up in the stores. It's silly, but it worked.
And that would be almost, I wouldn't say impossible, because I think we figured out over the past 2.5 years how to learn about people. But now that we're rounding out of this, work from home, work from anywhere kind of status quo, right? What's your views about getting back into the office? What are the benefits to people that, they should make the effort to get back in?
Well, I think there's very mixed views on whether people want to go back and how much they want to go back. I guess I'm a believer that we should have hybrid and there should be some time spent together. And that comes from a couple things. One, I think that although we figured out over the last couple of years how to be super productive on Zoom, a lot of it, or on any VC platform, a lot of it was all about efficiency. So we all had Zoom scheduled. So 7 o'clock, you get on, you go right to the point and get off at 7:30 to go to the next one. So I don't feel there was as much time created for getting to know each other. I also think I've been particularly noticing in professions that have some sort of, I would call it apprenticeship. So often partner-driven firms like accounting, legal, consulting, that the more senior people, although they initially resisted work from home because they felt their staff should be in, once they got adjusted, they're loving it. They've kind of made it. They know what they need to do at work. Maybe they have a bigger house with a nice office, and it's great to just stay home. The younger people who are just coming in and learn something by osmosis and not just training programs, they would never say, Ronen, can I get half an hour in your diary to ask you a question, over Zoom about this? But if they saw you in the hallway, they might go, or getting coffee, oh, Ronen, how's your day? How was your run? Hey, can you just look at that thing for me and tell me what you think? And so that second part is all gone if nobody's in. So I worry about that. And I just saw a study yesterday, I think that came out in the last month in the US, saying that Gen Z 40% of people are saying they're missing that mentorship, that in-person aspect of work. And then there's a whole nother issue that I'm not particularly up to speed with, but I do have kids in their 20s who've just started working. And part of what they've done to go to work is social, right? If you join a big company where there are a lot of young people like the Boston Consulting Group or Google or AppsFlyer, part of it is about meeting other people your age. I don't think that's your main objective, but there's something fun about it. And they've lost all that. So that's another issue. So I'm hoping that we'll return to, I'm sure every company will find its balance, but I think we'll return to something where there's a couple days where most people are together and not spread out, and then some where people are more flexible. The other thing that's a bit daunting, I listened to The Daily, I think, which is a New York Times podcast a couple days ago, where they're talking about all of the monitoring that's come in because of remote work. So apparently, there used to be a lot of monitoring at, for example, logistics facilities, and Amazon is famous for this, for knowing how much time people are packing boxes and how much time they're not there, and recording it to make people more efficient, but also understanding, hey, you need to allow time for me to maybe ask my boss a question in the hallway, go to the bathroom, have lunch, things like that. And now a lot of people find that they're working for companies that have downloaded in their software the ability to monitor them. So this episode has a lot about software that's created that takes a picture of your face and a screenshot every 10 minutes, and people being paid. If you're not on a screen and your face isn't there of something that looks like work, then they don't pay you for those 10-minute intervals. Wow. So, and companies are saying, well, that was a reaction to work from home because we don't know if you're working or not. And they gave a concrete example, which is the MTA, who runs the subways in New York, has recently made a deal with employees. If you want to have one day work from home on a Friday, you need to have full-time monitoring every day at work. So it's sort of like, we can trust you, but maybe not too much. So we're happy to have you have a day at home, but you need to agree to this. Some of the companies, apparently, I'm sure they've signed something somewhere, some of the people didn't know. So I'd hate to see us to get to that point where, because nobody knows where their employees are, we then have to have, science fiction style, 1984 style monitoring, although I think it's here.
Yeah, this is, maybe we can coin this as surveillance employment.
That's what they're calling it.
Yeah, wow, this is, we don't want to, definitely, we won't go there.
Right.
And we don't
happy to hear that.
I mean, not us as a company. I mean, definitely not us, but I think it's, we as a society don't want to get there. I mean, we need to have trust in people that they are doing what's right. And actually, we have this mindset in the company that we want people to think like founders and think like the CEO. If they feel that, they should be away from their computer or be working, but on a beach somewhere, well, if they think that's the best for the company, then, well, would that be aligned with how a CEO of a company would think?
Right.
Probably not.
Well, but it might be if the CEO thinks I need a break and I need to brainstorm for 5 minutes or 2 hours. And yeah, I guess I feel like the places I've worked, and hopefully the places I would connect with in the future, are ones that measure output. Just measuring screen time is not relevant, particularly if you're in a job that requires some thinking. I mean, you might still do it with a piece of paper, or lots of people are doing walking meetings now, I think. Healthy body, healthy mind, that's great. Maybe not in the middle of the... We did, maybe not in the middle of the day in Bangkok or Singapore, but yeah, I think there's lots of alternatives to that. So anyway, a lot of rambling thoughts, but I do hope that we get to a situation where there is some in-person time, or at least where people create their own, like you and I did this morning. Let's not just meet at the office, let's meet a bit before and walk together.
Right. And so there's this, concept that the world has about work-life balance. And I believe that you pretty vocal about what you think about work-life balance. Please share.
Sure. Have you known me not to be vocal, or at least opinionated on things?
You always have an opinion on something.
Yeah. So I guess, we've all toyed with this term, and I understand why people use it. But to me, work-life balance, it's like a seesaw or a scale. It means things are even. But that means that if you're really enjoying work, then if it's a seesaw, then you have to be enjoying life less, or the other way around. If you're really enjoying your life, somehow work isn't as good. And I just don't think life has to be that way. I don't think you can do everything you want all at once. You can't train as a triathlete and spend time with your kids and read 5 books a week and do your job and cook and get enough sleep, right? So you're making trade-offs. But I think on a full lifetime basis, you don't have to make those trade-offs. And even in the sort of work life, you can often do things that support both. So I'll give you a silly example about me, and then I'll give you some more professional examples.
Please.
But when I first graduated from college, I moved to New York City because that's what everybody was doing from where I went to university. And I found myself in a bank training program, and I still like to exercise every day, but at that time, the only thing I really knew how to do for exercise was swim. I hadn't sort of figured out aerobics yet. And in New York City, there were no, at least in Manhattan, there were no pools that were big enough to swim lengths, except for one that had a quota on people under 25. And a brand new one at NYU, New York University, that required you to go to New York University in order to get in. And so here I was, having spent 4 years at a reasonably hard university program, in an 8-hour-a-day bank training program, which was like a mini MBA, and faced with the only way to be able to get to a swimming pool that I could figure out was to take more classes. So another friend and I agreed to do this. We applied to NYU, we got in, and we started taking classes. And the upside was that the bank paid for it if we got certain grades.
Great.
And the swimming pool was near where we were both living.
Great.
The downside was apartment smelled like chlorine, and even less time to myself because I got the swimming, which was great, but then I had to do the studying in order to get the grades, so that was not so great. But so it's kind of silly, and when people ask me, why did you decide to get an MBA? How did you decide? I'm like, well, my decision is not a good outline for how you should think about it. But at the end of it, I found myself able to consider a lot more job options and careers. And ultimately, I decided I really wanted to live in Australia because my language skills aren't good, and I wanted to come to Asia. I thought I couldn't. I should have looked harder. It looked close. It's sunny. I'd spent 6 months in England, very nice, but soggy vegetables, rainy weather, wasn't going back there. And someone said to me, you should be a consultant. And I'm like, well, what's a consultant? And I said, well, you've done an MBA in marketing and you've got finance from the bank, so you can be a consultant. And that was how I ended up at BCG. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about this. But because I had gone and gotten this MBA and they were looking for people who had MBAs, I got a job at BCG, which I loved. So it sounds ridiculous, but I did something for my life that actually helped my career. And if I give you a slightly more relevant professional example, I have a friend in Australia who runs a company called Cast, which basically is a consulting firm that uses people who have been at the large consulting firms but want to be independent and farms them out to companies. And she's built a great business together with her business partner, and that's going along swimmingly. A few years ago, she decided she was quite agitated with the state of immigration in Australia. Your listeners may or may not be familiar. We had a lot of people stuck on Nauru Island for many years. We haven't necessarily figured out a great way to bring in new Australians. And so she was very focused on this and got heavily involved in how to bring in and assist what Australia calls new Australians. She was asked to go on the board of and chair something called the Bread and Butter Project, which is a sourdough bakery that at all times employs at least 50% new Australians. She has done such an amazing job helping them grow the business, expand, become noticed in Australia, get mini bakeries inside Woolies, one of the 2 large grocery chains, that she's been called to Parliament in Canberra to talk about this. She's all over things on LinkedIn. She did this completely outside of Cast, her business, but guess what? She's getting even more work at Cast because she's gone and done something that she really cared about in her life, and it's come back to pay her work. So there's many more examples in the book, but this is why I think you don't necessarily have to have that balance. It's not always obvious when you start down these paths, and some of them won't, necessarily directly affect your work like these 2 examples, but at the very least, they give you the energy, I think, the stamina, the motivation, the happiness that allows you to engage at work as well.
Yeah, so you actually, in your book, you talk about these 6 essential shifts or mind shifts that people need to go through. And you did, you just mentioned stamina, which I think is it's probably one of them, right? Without revealing too much about the book, Don't Quit Your Day Job, tell us about some of these essential mind shifts that people need to have, and actually how does it apply to the title of the book, Don't Quit Your Day Job?
Sure. Well, so for one thing, obviously, Don't Quit Your Day Job is not a great title for me since I quit my day job shortly before I wrote the book.
Right.
But what
you
I
needed time to write the book, so
Right.
you had to.
So that became my
right.
day job. But I think what I find when I spend time out talking to people is often the issue is not necessarily their job. So there's an example in there of a woman I'm friends with in Singapore who said, I've got to quit my job, and came to me for advice about where she should go. And actually, when I listened to her, and I'm not a trained coach or therapist, and maybe those people could even do this faster or better, but I just said, all these things you're talking to me about don't seem to have anything to do with your job. They seem to me to have to do with some issues around you not being in Europe and your family being there and maybe wanting a change of pace. And she works at a company that's like one of those, like a Unilever, P&G kind of place that, often people stay for their whole life, and those companies are really accommodating. And in the end, she didn't quit. She moved for a while. And so I just think that it's, when I listen to people, it's not always, they put it on their job, but it isn't always the job. And one of the things I think, and I'll come back to the mind shifts in a minute, but is that somewhere over time, jobs became something that are supposed to fulfill your passions. So even I'm not old enough to have been around in the Industrial Revolution, but I guess at that point, people came off farms and went to jobs because they needed them to live. And there probably wasn't any more in it. Nobody expected them to be fulfilling or rewarding or anything, just a way to get food on the table. And then, by the time I got into the workforce, which was much later, obviously, we wanted them to be rewarding and somewhat fulfilling and maybe learning, but maybe not as much as now we talk about lifelong learning, which I think is great, and really continuing to learn through your jobs. But at some point, we started using the word passion around work. And I think it's terrific if you have a job that you're passionate about, or you're in a company that you're passionate about. But not everybody is going to have a job that fulfills at least all of their passions. For example, if you're a dedicated equestrian, there might be, maybe you can be a jockey, maybe you could work at a horse farm, maybe, I know there's a lot of equine therapy now, but I'm not sure, or at least of the people I've met, I'm not sure there are enough jobs around horses for the people who love riding. I'm a bit scared of it myself, but this has come up a lot. So, for example, I know a professor in Singapore who has a great career, loves teaching, but also has used that as a way to ride. She loves to ride, and so one of the great things about being a professor is you at least have some very long holiday breaks, and you can use those even before COVID to go away, be somewhere else, and ride. She can use the money from that, to have horses. It's a decent enough profession to support it. So I think that sometimes passion is too high a bar. So if we come back to jobs and stamina and the mind shifts, one of them I call stamina as a muscle, build yours. So maybe strictly speaking, that's not a mind shift because I think everybody knows they need to have stamina. But what is stamina? So I wrote an equation. I don't think it's going to become as famous as E equals MC squared, but I'm working on it.
Let the world decide.
Let the world decide. I do have hair kind of like Einstein. So it's stamina equals perseverance plus enthusiasm. So I think perseverance is important, but it's not enough. And there, Angela Duckworth writes about grit, which is really important. And I think there's a lot to be said for sticking things out, and not that that's what she's talking about, and really putting in a lot of effort. But you don't really want it to be a grind, not your whole life. Like I worked for 40 years for somebody else, and I guess being on boards can be considered still working. So maybe it's more years than that. And it's just really, I think, unhealthy if you're hating every minute of it. You're going to have bad days, bad weeks, maybe even a bad year where you're really trying to get through something in your job. But I think if you can find a way to do that with some level of enthusiasm and positivity, it will keep you going. And that may be something in your job, or it may be something outside that gives you that motivation. And I'll give you an example of stamina that I wrote about. So there was a woman who I called Barbara, because she didn't want to be disclosed in the book, who I met when she was at a tech firm. And she said, I've got to quit. So I could use your help, finding another place. I'm like, why do you have to quit? Well, I'm in my mid to late 20s. She was, I think, 27. And I've been the head of sales here for 3 years, and they're bringing in a new head of sales. And I said, okay. And she's like, well, that is demeaning and demoralizing. I should be the head of sales. And I said, well, maybe, but you're in a company that is kind of a rocket ship of growth. It's doing really well. And they've probably see themselves as getting to that next level of needing somebody who's got a bit more experience. I know you've been doing it for a few years, and I know you're well thought of, but you are slightly young in the workforce. Like you've had only 5 years of work experience. This person they're bringing in over you has had, I think, around 20. And I happen to know him, and he's a great leader. He really cares about his people, and I think you might learn from him. And she said, no, got to go. Just too hard on me. And I said, okay, well, look, here's my point of view. You can still quit in 2 months or even 2 days if you really, it's just so awful. But if you quit before he comes, how will you know? And I think you might like him and you might learn something from him. So I doubt it was only my sagacious advice. But she somehow had the stamina to stay through something that was making her miserable. She didn't like the idea. And ultimately, she learned a ton from this guy. She stayed, I think, like another 4 years. Wow. She got promoted twice, including once while on maternity leave, which shouldn't be worth noting, but unfortunately I think still is. And then went to, I think she's on her second company after that, as a chief revenue officer at a company that's maybe Series D funded. So I think if she had left then, she would still do well, still would have done well. She's smart, she's capable. But my guess is she would have continued to be head of sales for Series A, maybe Series B companies. I think the fact that she had the stamina, found a way to persevere with enthusiasm, enabled her to really grow, learning from somebody else, and then parlay that into even bigger roles for herself.
This is such an important point, because I think a lot of people, they will stop at this point where the emotion of having someone coming in above them, or the change that they think that they won't be able to handle, versus taking the progress, right? Sometimes you have to bear the emotion. You have to have the stamina to go through it if you want to have the progress.
Right.
And I think you can't have both, right? Because sometimes you just have to put the emotion to the side and say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to have the grit. I'm going to have the resilience to pass through this difficult period so that I do achieve what is going to be better for me in the long term. And I think you gave that's an excellent example. And I think that a lot of times people don't want to accept that as part of the steps that they need to go through to achieve the progress.
Right. I think they can still feel that emotion, right? You can't make it go away, but do you make the decision that I'm going to have the stamina to stick it out for a while and see? Because you can always leave, right? But it's harder to come back. And actually, sorry, I was just going to say this. I read a few months ago that almost 5% of people who have left in the Great Resignation in the U.S. have come back to their former jobs, which is, the kind of, I was frustrated or I was angry, and so I left, and then I realized actually what I left for wasn't any better. So when you do decide to leave, you want to make sure that you're leaving for a good reason and for something great out there, not just because of, as you said, the emotion of, I don't want being layered over.
Right. Yeah, I like the layered over example that you do give in the book, because I think this is something that as companies go through their own progression, you need people that have different skills and different experience to help take the company to the next level. Right. And sometimes you have that within the company already, but sometimes, you have to bring in external talent and build that talent density so that actually people do understand that there is another level that I can go to, and my new boss will also be a mentor to help me get there. Right. And actually, this is, I want to use this moment to talk about you being kind of one of my people that I've looked up to for quite some time. And I've consulted you at quite a few points in my own career about difficult decisions, and you've always asked the great questions and helped me think through things. But how does someone out there find a mentor? Like, what is the mental model that someone in their career needs to go through and in identifying their right mentor? And how does the mentor, because mentors don't, you also choose the people that you want to mentee, right? You do this quite a bit. Talk to us a little bit about that as well.
Sure. So I've come up with, a different mental model. It's not my idea, but I read about it and I really believe in it, which is about having a personal board of directors. I think many people have mentors, and I probably have mentored a few people, but if someone says to me, will you be my mentor, that really scares me. I feel very responsible, and I will usually say no, unless it's an official, like sometimes at work, they pair you up.
I don't think I gave you a choice, did I?
Well, I don't think you asked me. It just happened. That's the thing. I think a lot of it happens by getting to know people and chemistry, and so that's what I really like. But of course, that means that sometimes you may be without a mentor. Then I think there's something that's really important, which is a sponsor or an advocate who needs to be in your company. It's probably naturally, at least when you first start, your boss, but it could be somebody else, and that's the person who sticks their neck out and says, okay, it's Ronen's turn for a promotion, or it's Ronen wants this job, and this is the reason he's the right guy for it. So how do you get that kind of advice if you don't have somebody who's already become your mentor, right? And some firms sort of assign these, or they'll have a career development buddy or something like that. But it's not always the person you want to turn to anyway. So what I wish I had done much earlier is start to build this kind of personal board of directors. And the idea is that, similar to a corporate board of directors, you want to have maybe a variety of people. It could be maybe 4 to 6, I think 8 getting a bit on the heavy side. Some real boards of directors will have 12 or more, but I think that's hard for a person to manage, who you can go to over a longish period of time so they get to know you, to get advice, and where you're building at least some sort of relationship. I don't think you have to be best buddies, but it can't be you're just calling them for advice, you don't know anything about them, you don't care. I don't think that will work. And the reason for that is several-fold. So if we think about real boards of directors, their main job, their most important job is to hire and fire the CEO. Okay, that's not relevant for a personal board of directors. Don't worry, they can't fire you. They can disconnect as a board member, but other than that. But they tend to, like if you're using a search firm, boards will make matrices now. They'll say, like, I don't know who's on the AppsFlyer board, but let's say we need someone who understands tech and somebody who understands advertising and somebody who understands maybe the future of media. Let's just say those as kind of industry things. And then maybe we want somebody who really understands IT systems and somebody who really understands design and somebody who really understands HR. And maybe now these days we need somebody who understands ESG. And you end up with this matrix. And that's how they kind of pick board members, bringing different kinds of expertise. So as you develop, you need people who can give you outside perspective and maybe ask you some questions. So again, a couple examples here. I wish I'd done it earlier, especially for periods in my life where I felt there wasn't somebody who I could necessarily turn to who understood my issues at that time. And you don't have to have the one person then. You can have 5 or 6 where there's kind of component parts. So I didn't do it till I started wanting to go on boards, which was maybe 12 years ago. And I went to a friend of mine named Allison Davis, who was already on boards, and said, oh, never going to get on a board, and I don't know how to do this. And she's like, why aren't you going to get on board? And I said, well, I'm running this billion-dollar business at Google, but they're telling me I'm not C, I didn't have a C title. So she said, okay, have you told anybody you want to be on a board? I said, no. I said, well, that might be a good idea. So that was my first incredible bit of insight. I sound like an idiot, right? But I just really didn't know how it worked, and I hadn't thought about it. And in the book, I wrote about Susie Nicoletti, who's a real person who I have mentored over the years, who was running Twitter Australia and is now running Yotpo for Asia. And she had a period at Google where she didn't get promoted, or a time at Google where she didn't get promoted. And she talked to an older gentleman who knew her And all of her friends at Google were with her going like, you should have been promoted. Like, that's ridiculous. I don't know why they didn't do it. And they were all, morally supportive, up in arms for her, which is great moral support, but didn't give her any insight. And this outside gentleman said, it's interesting. I think you're really good with other people and a great team player. But when you, Susie, talk about your work, what I hear about is your clients, which is great. I like that bit, and what you've achieved with them. I never hear anything about the rest of the team. And I know you're not a team lead yet, but it's almost as if you've done this on your own. And I know that isn't the case, but that might be what your boss is hearing. And I've since heard from her then boss, who didn't promote her, that was in fact part of it. It seemed like she was kind of a individual contributor and wasn't ready for management, didn't really care about her team, which is not true, but it was how Susie was presenting herself. And it was a really insightful piece of, it wasn't even advice. He was just feeding back to her what he saw from the outside, which was something she could clearly get from a board member and not from her sort of moral support group, her friends. And she got promoted the next time around.
Wow, that's great. I love this this whole personal board of directors concept, and you being one of my personal board members. I'm super appreciative of you actually taking the time to come on today's show. But before we end it, I love to do the rapid fire session.
Okay, well, before we get to the rapid fire, can I add one thing about boards of directors?
Please.
I'm just trying to stave off the inevitable,
Right.
I'm worried about the rapid fire, but
Yeah, what's your email address?
no, I was going to say on the boards, yours and mine happened partly by, I guess, coincidence over time, having some mutual friends. But I think there's a lot of practical advice in the book. But the one thing, first of all, I wouldn't ask anybody to, don't say, can you be on my board? Because I don't think that language is common enough yet. And I think it might
Yet, but that'll be
confuse
another
people.
thing that you will leave with the world.
Maybe, but I think, figure out who are the people who might give you insight. It could be the parent of a friend. It could be the friend of a parent. It could be somebody you met as probably not your direct client right now, but at a client. If you want to change from tech into the medical field, maybe you need to talk to somebody who's a doctor or somebody who's in hospital administration, somebody older, somebody who made the switch that you're making. Think about the kind of people who would give you insight. And maybe for some of them, it's like a one-off chat and you don't find them useful, or you don't start to build a relationship and you just let it go. But for others, if it seems to be useful, I think, you want to actually be interested in what they are doing. And then you want to keep that up, maybe sometime between 2 and 4 times a year, and it doesn't have to be a friendship, but it's enough so that you know what's going on with them. So for you, I never know if it's you and I or you and me. I think for you and me, Ronen, what happened is we got to know each other, and then we'd see each other occasionally at some industry events, or we'd call each other. Then we ended up in a couple of the same WhatsApp groups, so that if you do call me for advice, and sometimes I ask you for help too, it's mutual, I kind of know what's been going on. It's not like it's out of thin air. Okay, I met you 4 years ago and all of a sudden you want me to comment on something about your career, because that would be out of context. But because we've kept in touch, right? Yeah. I have enough context to maybe ask some good questions.
So, and this goes back to just building those relationships, and sometimes you know what they are for, sometimes you don't. Right, but it's all on us to be able to maintain the people that we've met over the years, because we never know when that person will become a more meaningful part of our lives.
Right, at least some of them. You probably can't maintain all of them, right? Even with LinkedIn and everything else, you probably can't. But pick the ones where you've really connected or enjoyed. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's great, and thank you for unpacking that more, because I think it's very important. Actually, one of my coaches told me that I should learn how to unpack much more with issues and not let them settle on the surface. So you did a great job there, and that's why I have you as a personal board of director. But now we are going into the rapid fire session, because I think this is one of the most fun parts of these podcasts. And you talk about stamina, and you've obviously accomplished so many things in your career and your personal life. What is the one thing that you still want to achieve?
I want to do a 5K open water swim. I've only done 2.
Wow.
Ocean swim.
5K. So that would probably be like 2 hours in the water?
It's about 25 minutes a kilometer, but then it gets slower because of the ocean, so
Yeah.
maybe, yeah.
And hopefully you don't get into any jellyfish.
Hopefully not.
Yeah.
Or sharks, because we do them in
My
Australia.
first triathlon was in waters filled with jellyfish.
Oh, ouch.
I was lucky that I was actually one of the last people to jump into water.
Oh, because the jellyfish weren't stinging anymore?
Well, we didn't know. I mean, I guess they weren't stinging anymore because they had stung everyone that they needed to sting already. I still didn't win, but that's besides the point. Here's a funny one for you. Have you ever been radioactive?
Okay, well, presumably you don't ask other people this, but that was a loaded question because yes, I have. And the story behind this very quickly is that I had one of those MRI scans or something one day, and the next day I ended up at a conference in Hong Kong, where Ronen was as well. And this involved going into the China mainland, where I set off one of those sensors because I had the radioactive color liquid in my blood. And you know what? If you only speak a few words of Chinese like me, it is not explainable to security why you are setting off the machine, even after they pat you down and see that you have nothing on them. Hence, being saved by my hero, I might be a bit of yours, but my hero, Ronen, who kept me out of Chinese security jail.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a loaded question, but I think to be honest, I think that experience alone solidified our relationship.
Right. That's the point about sometimes seeing people in person. Yes. You can't predict what happens. And it's a great story and one we'll both remember.
What's the last book you've read?
I'm reading two at a time. So nonfiction, Empire of Pain. I just finished it, which is about the opioid epidemic in the U.S. and very frightening and horrific, really, to think about what we let companies and the FDA do and how many people have been injured by this. Mm-hmm. And then I read Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is a story about books and people and relationships by Anthony Doerr, who wrote All the Light We Cannot See, which is a really fun novel.
Mm-hmm. How many books do you read? A year, a month?
I don't know, a lot.
A lot.
I am an avid reader. And during COVID, I discovered electronic library cards. I was too lazy to get them before. I just pick up books at the airport. And the Singapore National Library has got absolutely everything. So I've got all these books on the go all the time. I love it.
Wow. And actually, you want to guess what are the books that I just read?
Oh, well, hopefully it was Don't Quit Your Day Job. What an amazing book.
Yeah, we're going to be handing out some signed copies later. And of course, since you're at AppsFlyer, what's the last app that you downloaded?
Oh, well, this isn't a very exciting one for you, sadly. It's Diligent, which is one of the board platforms for reading board papers. And actually, I find it really hard to look at my board papers on my phone. It's hard enough on my laptop. But every once in a while, I have to look up something at the last minute or go back to it. And so I can use it on my phone now.
Aliza, last question. The most inspirational person to you, whether they are alive or have moved on?
Well, there are a couple. There are a lot. There are two I would name today.
Mm-hmm.
One is Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I think became pretty famous in the last couple of years as somebody really pushing the Supreme Court to stay to the left, if you will. And another is Cecile Richards, who ran Planned Parenthood in the U.S., which is something that's very important to me and is obviously having to really step up its role now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned.
Amazing. Thank you for coming in and joining us on Epicenter today, Aliza Knox.